So I'm going to need some help with you, from you this morning. We're going to talk about some heavy things, some weightier matters. You heard Darian read the text, right? There's nothing chipper about what we're reading, what we're studying this morning, and what Jesus has faced. And so there's going to be some weightiness to this, but actually my goal is that we would leave this place overjoyed. Okay, so gravity and gladness is what I want us to feel, but I'm gonna need some of your help with this, because sometimes when you go down a deep, dark hole, which we will, it's hard to get out. You go down a deep, dark hole and you get into the kind of places in your heart that you haven't gone to in a while or ever, and we miss or we forget that this is a gospel sermon, and we're talking about the good news of the gospel, and that even when we go down into the dark hole, there's also the light of the hope of the glory of God, yes? And so there's going to take some work on my behalf in regards to how I speak of this and the tone in which I take and all of that. But there's also a responsibility that you have in how you hear, the tone of your heart, the way in which you hear this and what you hold on to, and the hope that I want you to grab a hold of. Okay. But here's what we're going to talk about. Like reading through this text this week and even just hearing her read it again is just hard, right? It's hard because we're going to talk about the trauma that Jesus faced, right? The suffering that he faced, the belittling, knowing also what comes next for him, right? It comes next for him right away in real life. For us, it's next week that we'll cover it, but we know what it just continues on into next week. The suffering, the belittling, the persecution, the trauma that Jesus faced. I want to consider that. I want to look at that. And it also kind of begs the question for us, and I think it's a good question, is why? Why did he have to do this? Why did Jesus have to die? That's a fair question. It's a good question, right? Why did he have to face this suffering? Why was this necessary? In fact, over and over in Luke, if you've walked with us, we've seen him tell us over and over that this is going to be necessary, that this very moment in his life was going to be necessary. Way back in Luke chapter 9, where Luke said he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, that he was the Christ, the Messiah. And then he said, the Son of Man must suffer many things. He must suffer. This was necessary, that he would be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day raised. Same thing in Luke chapter 17. For as the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in this day. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. And then again in Luke chapter 18, same thing. Taking the 12, he said to them, see, we're going up to Jerusalem. Everything that is written about me by the prophets will be accomplished, for he, the Son of Man, will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated, spit upon. After flogging him, they will kill him, and on the third day, he will rise. Jesus said over and over again that this was necessary, and it's a fair question to ask, why? Why? If the cross is so central to the gospel, if the cross is so central to the teaching of Christianity, if the cross is so essential to you and I being saved or rescued from ourselves, from our sin, why did it have to go down this way? Why was this the way that it had to go down? Two things. We could talk about this for weeks, but let me boil it down into two reasons why Jesus had to suffer and die. The first reason could simply be called sin. Because of our sin, because of our rejection of God, Jesus had to die, right? We rejected God, and because we rejected God, we deserve death and hell. Okay, that's just, it's not a popular take. It's not very nice to hear, but it makes it no less true. We are sinners and we deserve death and hell. Welcome to the Paradox Church, okay? You deserve death and hell. There's coffee in the back. We love you. So glad that you're here, but we deserve death and hell. And it doesn't feel good to hear, and it's not popular to say, and yet logically, I think we could actually get there. It's not that hard to really understand. If God is life, if we were to assume that God is life and the creator of life, then the rejection of God is the rejection of life. To reject God is to reject life. Here's kind of my illustration for this. God is like the sun. Did you see the first images that came out of the new Webb telescope? And they kind of, showed us deep into space, deeper than we've ever seen, and all that. Like, those are galaxies that we're seeing there, right? There's thousands and thousands of galaxies that we can see. God is the creator of all of them, all of them. And our sun is really just an average-sized star in our galaxy that happens to be the closest to our solar system, and yet our star gives us light and life. The very essence of our star, the sun, the very essence of it is to give light and life. And yet at the same time, if we turn from it, if we reject the sun, so to speak, then we have nothing but darkness and cold and death if we don't have the sun. Right? The sun is actually sovereign over light and life and warmth and heat, and it's also sovereign over darkness and cold, because if it turns away from us, or if we turn away from it, to be scientifically more accurate, we turn away from it, then it leaves us in the dark. God is the same way, right? God is the same way. To reject God is to reject life. There's just an existential reality to life, to the rejection of God, that the rejection of God leads to death. Then, of course, some might say, how have I rejected God, though? Pastor, you don't really know me. I'm actually a pretty good guy, not all that bad. I'm not perfect, but I'm not, Hitler. Have you ever noticed how we always compare ourselves to the worst possible people ever, right? We're just like, I'm not that bad because of him. It's like saying, we're a pretty good baseball team because we're not the Rangers, right? Or they're terrible. Or, we're a pretty good band because we're not, Nickelback or whoever's a bad band. Whatever's a bad band in your mind. Or we compare ourselves to the worst. I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad. And yet the problem is we kind of think about God as some sort of cosmic policeman, and sin then is we go 5 miles over the speed limit. And so it's just this little bitty sin, and that betrays or just flat out misunderstands the nature of our relationship to God. We were made in God's image, in this covenant relationship with God. We're not just talking about us versus a policeman. We're talking about this unified relationship. God has bound himself to us, and we have rejected that relationship. I'll give you another illustration. When a husband lusts after someone that's not his wife, that's not just a little bit of sin against his wife. He has betrayed the very essence of that relationship and what that relationship is. Right? A husband and a wife, they are bound together. They are one. They are united together. Right? They are tied up together, and to even look outside of that relationship is to reject the very essence of the relationship itself. It's why Jesus is likened to the church as a husband to a bride. We have divorced ourselves from the relationship with God, and yet God in Christ has wooed us back through self-sacrifice and love. It's not just a little bit of sin. This is a rejection of God's love. It's a rejection of life, and that leads to death. So the first reason that Jesus has to suffer and die for us in our place is because of sin. Sin leads to death. Sin is the rejection of God that leads to death. The second reason that Jesus has to suffer and die, we could just call sympathy. All right, so the first is sin. The second is sympathy. The book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus, he can sympathize with us because he has suffered everything that we suffer, that he knows. We talked about this last week, that because Jesus walked with us, because Jesus has suffered with us, he knows the gut punch of betrayal. He knows what it's like when friends are not there for us in our greatest time of need. He knows what it's like to have to pray to God and to have the Father say no as his answer. He knows. And so when we're sick and when we're tired and when we're lonely, we can go to Jesus because he knows physical pain. He knows emotional agony. He knows relational isolation. He knows what that's like. He can sympathize with us, and so we can go to him because he knows. And we see the need for this sympathy evidenced today in our text as well, because we see the trauma that Jesus faced. I want us to consider the trauma that Jesus is experiencing here. In verse 63 again, we see the men, it says, were holding Jesus. They were holding him in custody, and they were mocking him as they beat him. All right, so the men that are holding him, these are the temple guards, the religious leaders, these are the Jews, these are his own people. Later, it's gonna be the Roman rulers, the Roman guards, the Gentiles, so Jews and Gentiles, literally the whole world is rejecting Jesus. Literally the whole world is abusing Jesus. Verse 64, they also blindfolded him. They kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. Okay, so circle, highlight, mocking, beating, blindfolding, saying many things against him. When I was reading that this week, I just wrote down in my notes, a litany of abuse. That Jesus, he faced a litany of abuse. They were mocking and beating him. So this wasn't just physical, this was emotional too, right? They're not just hitting him, they're calling him names, they're mocking him. I can't imagine the torment of being blindfolded and not knowing when the next punch was coming. I mean, that's torment. That's torture. And then they even mock his prophetic gifts. So this is spiritual abuse. This is emotional abuse. This is physical abuse. Jesus is facing legit trauma. It can be easy to over-spiritualize moments in the Bible. Like we're reading things in the Bible. We can over-spiritualize them sometimes and not like read them like we would hear somebody tell their story. And we miss the obvious things, like here where Jesus is facing legit trauma. This is trauma. Jesus is being questioned a number of times by multiple people. So first here by the Jewish leaders, then they take him to Pilate, the Roman ruler. If you jump to chapter 23, verse 10, the religious leaders again, they vehemently accuse him. Then Pilate, he sends him to Herod, who's the Jewish political leader. Verse 11, Herod and his soldiers, it says they treat him with contempt and they mock him. Over and over, Jesus is facing abuse and accusation and trauma and torment. Over and over and over by the whole world. Jews, Gentiles, he is facing abuse. Now, it's interesting to think of this as being traumatic of Jesus, because he's Jesus, right? He's God. We read this, and we're like, kind of just think of him as God, and we forget that he's also man, right? That he's God in the flesh, that he's fully God, but also fully man, that Jesus got tired sometimes and got hungry and he would get thirsty, that he was fully man. And in his humanity, he's beginning to experience trauma. We saw it last week. We're in the garden. He begins to sweat drops of blood in his emotional agony. He's sweating drops of blood. Here, he's being falsely accused and questioned. He's physically and verbally abused. Next week, it gets worse and he faces unreal physical torment. Right? Agony, abuse, torment. If that's not a traumatic experience, I don't know what is. And it's interesting. My wife told me to be careful at this point in the sermon, so I will kind of. But what's interesting is in our kind of day, right, in which we talk about a lot trauma, triggers, PTSD, and abuse, right? We talk about those things a lot, which is obviously a good thing. Our collective cultural knowledge has increased, and we have a better understanding of mental health. We have a better understanding of those things, and that is monumentally important that we would get that right, that the church would get that right, that we'd figure out how to identify trauma and abuse and to properly care for that and properly stay out of some of the things that we should probably stay out of. And yet, one of the things that can be frustrating, especially for somebody that has maybe experienced actual trauma and actual abuse, or you know somebody that's experienced actual trauma and actual abuse, is when then everything becomes abuse and everything is traumatic, right? Everything is, because if everything is, then nothing is. And psychiatrists now, they're beginning to kind of differentiate between a big T trauma and little t trauma. That's super helpful. But here's my point. This is big T trauma. What Jesus is facing is legit trauma, legit abuse. This is traumatic for Jesus. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, the author does extensive research on trauma victims, and what he says about the relationship of trauma victims is interesting, whether it's parents or kids or lovers. He says this: after trauma, the world becomes sharply divided between those who know and those who don't. People who have not shared the traumatic experience cannot be trusted because they can't understand it. Trauma victims struggle to trust anyone. right? The world becomes sharply divided between those who know and those who don't. But Jesus says, I know. I know what that's like. I know, I've experienced that. I know emotional agony, and I know verbal abuse, and I know physical torment. I know what that's like. I know what it's like not to have bodily autonomy. I know what it's like to not have free agency, to be beaten or bound or trapped or chained or whipped or out of control. To where whether you're a slave in the American South being beaten or whipped, or you're a Jew in a concentration camp, or you're a soldier on the battlefield, or you're a young boy at the wrong house, or you're a single gal or a college gal at the wrong party, Jesus says, I know. I know. And he knows your story because it's his story. And even though he's writing your story differently through his death and resurrection, and there's hope for it, in the midst of the chapters, as you live it out, Jesus comes alongside of you and says, I know. I know what that's like. You can trust him because he knows. Jesus can sympathize. This is one reason why he must suffer many things, so he can suffer with us. But also, this is a problem of sin that Jesus needs to save us from. This is what sin does. It traumatizes. Right? Whether the sin that's done against us can be traumatizing, maybe it's our sin that does the trauma, or maybe it's even our response, our sin in response to the sin that's been done to us that can lead to even more pain. Some of the most self-destructive people that I know are self-destructive because first, trauma happened to them. I'll never forget a gal we were caring for in the midst of her abuse, and she felt like these were the words like she heard. This is how she thought of herself, that I'm damaged goods. And if you're damaged goods, then what's a little bit more damage, even if it's self-inflicted? And so our sin, even in response to trauma, can lead to even more trauma, even more pain. It's that mind job that trauma does to you as well. It doesn't just do something to the body, but to the mind. One other quote from the book that stood out to me addresses this. The author's not a Christian. He's not going to go deep into the idea of sin or iniquity, where our heart and mind is bent or broken, but he says this. He says, trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and the brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. He's saying trauma rewires the brain. Sin does that too. Sin rewires the brain. It changes the way in which we think. I read this story years ago that's always fascinated me. It's the story of Bill Zeller. Bill Zeller wasn't a Christian. In fact, he hated Christians. His parents were fundamentalist Christians, or at least that's what he thought from his perspective. And so he didn't like Christians. He became this really well-known web programmer, but his childhood was filled with a lot of abuse. And so he had this huge following on the web, and he ended up committing suicide a few years ago, but not before he posted his suicide note on the web for all of his followers to see. And so it kind of became well known. But listen to some of what he describes of his trauma. He says, this darkness, which is the only way that I can describe it, has followed me like a fog. But at times it intensified and overwhelmed me, usually triggered by a distinct situation. The darkness is with me nearly every time I wake up. I feel like a grime is covering me. I feel like I'm trapped in a contaminated body that no amount of washing will clean. Whenever I think about what happened, I feel manic and itchy, and I can't concentrate on anything else. It manifests itself in hours of eating, or staying up for days at a time, or sleeping for 16 hours straight, or going to the gym constantly. I'm exhausted from feeling like this every hour of every day. I'm reminded every morning of what was done to me and the control that it has over my life. I've never been able to stop thinking about what happened to me, and this has hampered my social interactions. I would be angry and lost in thought, and then be interrupted by someone saying hi or making small talk. I'm unable to understand why I seem cold and distant and to make normal human niceties. I'm just in a constant darkness. I am a broken, miserable shell of a human being. Being abused has defined me as a person, shaped me as a human being, and it has made me the monster that I am, and there's nothing I can do to escape it. I don't know any other existence. I don't know what life feels like where I'm apart from any of this. I actively despise the person I am. I just feel fundamentally broken, almost human, almost non-human. This is what sin does. It breaks everything. Sin is traumatic. It changes us almost at a cellular level. Whether sin done against us or sin that we do, we need to be rescued. We need a Savior. Now, here's another thing that sin does, and it's also part of our problem, because it keeps us from trusting Jesus. Right? So just like trauma can keep us from trusting any relationship, sin can keep us from trusting Jesus. Look back at verse 66. Verse 66, when day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council. And they said, verse 67, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. Underline, circle, highlight that. Verse 69. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. I love that. I don't have time to get into it. Jesus is saying, you judge me now, but I'm the judge, actually. Verse 70. So they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. Then they said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. So real quick, by the way, this is why they killed Jesus, because he says that he is God. Right? They didn't kill Jesus because he was nice and did healing or anything like that. We can't say Jesus is a good teacher. We can't call him a good guy. We got to take him at his own terms. We either reject what he says he is or who he says he is, or we accept him as God. But it's his response to them that is most striking to me. If I tell you, you will not believe. If I ask you a question, you will not answer. If that is not an indictment on our own skeptical age, I don't know what is. That's the very definition of our skeptical culture. Right? Is Jesus the Christ? Are you the Christ? Is Jesus God? If I answer you, you won't believe. If I was to ask you a couple of questions, you couldn't even give me a genuine answer. That's a skeptical age. Skepticism, a skeptical age, is where you're asking a bunch of questions, but you're not really looking for real answers. A little bit later, when Jesus is being questioned by Pilate, Luke doesn't cover this part of the conversation, but the Gospel of John does, where Jesus says to Pilate, I came here to bear witness to the truth. And Pilate skeptically says, what is truth? What is truth? There's nothing true. We can't think straight because of sin. We become skeptical, cynical, distrusting, paranoid, and anxious. That's what sin does. Right? It leads to trauma. It leads to skepticism. It stirs up the skepticism in us to where we can't see straight. The Son of God is literally right before them, and they don't see him. They've been waiting for the Savior. They've been waiting for the Messiah their whole lives. He's right there. They ask him if he's the Christ, and they don't believe him. Jesus is blindfolded, but they're the ones that actually can't see. This is what sin does. It traumatizes us. It leaves us half human or almost non-human, Bill Zeller says. And it's interesting because we struggle to humanize Jesus, but he's actually more human than we are. We struggle to see. Well, what's happening? Sin, it infects and affects every aspect of us. Trauma affects the whole of the person, not just the mind, but also the body. Sin does the same thing, mind, body, and soul. We've been traumatized by the sin done against us. We're traumatized by the sin that we commit, and we can't even see God if he was right before us. And so God's answer is to come in the flesh. Jesus comes in the flesh, and he becomes like us. He becomes human. We're non-human. We're part human. We're broken humans. So Jesus, he becomes like us, and he puts on flesh, and he becomes human, and he walks with us, and he eats with our prostitutes, and he drinks with our sinners, and he heals people, and he gets tired, and he gets hungry, and even faces trauma and abuse, that he might sympathize with us, that he might take our place. Jesus doesn't just experience what we experience so he can say, I know. Jesus experiences what we experience so he can take our place. He could be a substitute for us. This is the very message of Christianity in the gospel, that Jesus takes our place. This is the reason why Luke closes this text up with the story of Barabbas. Look in verse 18, chapter 23, verse 18. All of a sudden, this guy Barabbas shows up. But they all cried out together, away with Jesus, away with this man, and release to us Barabbas. Who's Barabbas? Where did Barabbas come from? Verse 19, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. So here's what's happening here. Pilate, the Roman ruler in that region, he kind of had this custom going to gain the goodwill of the people that he was ruling over, to release to them one prisoner on the Passover weekend. And so he's basically saying, hey, do you want me to release Jesus since I find no fault with him? Do you want me to release Jesus? And they say, no, we want you to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus, okay? So Barabbas, who's guilty, he led an insurrection, he's a murderer. Barabbas, who's guilty, goes free, and Jesus, who is innocent, is condemned. Jesus takes the place of Barabbas. And what's even more interesting is that Barabbas, that's his last name, that name means son of the Father. Bar, son, Abba, Father. So Barabbas' last name means son of the Father. Luke doesn't tell us this, but in the Gospel of Matthew, he tells us his first name. His first name is Jesus. His first name is Jesus Barabbas. And so check this, you've got Jesus, the Son of God, innocent, who stands condemned, in the place of Jesus, Barabbas, son of the Father. The guilty one gets to go free. See, Luke puts this in here. Luke is highlighting this moment for us because we are to see that we are Barabbas, that Jesus takes our place, that we're the guilty ones who deserve death and hell, and yet what we get is life and joy in him because Jesus takes our place. This is where I think we should leave overjoyed. I want you to imagine with me something. Do you think Barabbas ever got over this moment? Do you think he ever got over this moment? Like he literally saw Jesus take his cross. That cross was meant for him. He literally saw Jesus take his place. He was condemned to die and he got life, right? Life. Like imagine anything else that Barabbas would have experienced after this day. Like any suffering or sorrow would it'd be nothing compared to the moment of joy here. Like food would taste better for him. Music would sound sweeter. Relationships would be richer. Like imagine the rest of his life. Condemned to die, guilty, set free to live with joy. Jesus takes his place. My guess is there's not a skeptical bone in Barabbas' body the rest of his life. Just overjoyed at new life. We are Barabbas. Jesus took our place. Jesus was abused for our sin. He experienced trauma to rescue us. And listen, after his death and resurrection, when he reveals himself, when he shows himself to some of his followers, some of them are still skeptical. Isn't that interesting? Like there's this text in, I think it's Matthew 28, where he's about to float up into heaven, okay? Like float up into heaven. And he gives them the Great Commission, right? Go and tell everyone about me, baptize them, make disciples of all nations, right? And the text says this, it says, as he's going up into heaven, they worshiped him, but then it says, and some doubted, right? He's like floating into heaven. They're like, I don't know, maybe. Maybe? I mean, it's a decent chance, but I'm not so sure. It was hilarious. So some of them were skeptical. Some of them were doubting. What would Jesus do to show them that he truly was risen? That they weren't seeing a ghost? He would show them his scars. Jesus kept his scars. He kept them. New resurrected body, perfection. but he shows them his hands and his feet. Jesus doesn't whitewash his history, and he doesn't whitewash yours. And he gives us hope, and he gives us victory in his resurrection, but even in the midst of the pain, even in the midst of the trauma, when it's still hard, when it's hard for you to find joy, when you get down into the deep, dark places of your heart and it's hard to see the light, he comes and he meets with you in there and he shows you his scars. He says, I know. I know. There's hope in me. There's hope in me. There's victory in me. This won't always be this way. My resurrection is proof of that. But I know what that's like. One of the hardest parts about being a pastor is just kind of getting a front row seat to like the worst moments in people's lives. To see the evil that's been done, the trauma that you've experienced. We step into that space and we've got our own issues, we've got our own traumas, we've got our own abuse, maybe we've got our own. We step into that space and it's hard. One of the things, my wife and I were talking about this recently, and she in fact reminded me of this. One of the reasons why we started this church, it wasn't because Fort Worth needed another Sunday morning service. It wasn't because Fort Worth needed another church. What we wanted to do is create a place and foster a people to where you could deal with those deep places in the heart that you don't go to very often. You could deal with the trauma. You could talk about the abuse and you could experience the glory and grace of God in that place. Right? God's not some cosmic policeman just waiting to blow the whistle on us, and so we need a little bit of grace. We need restoration. We need healing. We need a Savior that meets us in the place that we're broken. And so we walk in those spaces, and you walk in those spaces with one another. I know there's only a few people probably that you can share some of those places with, and that's probably healthy and right and good. But as you dialogue with one another in your community, in the church, and share some of your trauma, just like the pastors are stepping into that place, you're stepping into that place, and it's hard. This is the only hope that we have to offer you. This is the only thing that we would ever give to you. This truth, this reality, that you have a God who is not distant, you have a God who is not just out there, you have a God who's not just some cosmic policeman, you have a God who stepped into that same space and faced the same things, and he knows. You can trust him.